Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Will Roulette. I'm the Deputy Director of National Guard Educational Foundation. I'm pleased to welcome you here to the National Guard Memorial. I want to thank the board and leadership of the National Guard Association of the United States. In particular, our president, Major General Retired Francis McGinn. This month is the 80th anniversary of the surrender of Japan and the end of the Second World War. So that's why we're so excited to host this author today. Judy Reed is the daughter of New Mexico National Guard veteran and Bataan Death March survivor Errett Lujan. Sergeant Lujan served in the 200th and 515th Coastal Artillery Regiments during World War II. He survived the Japanese invasion of the Philippines, the surrender of American forces there, the Bataan Death March, and years as a POW. Judy Reed is a retired archaeologist and published author. She was instrumental in establishing the New Mexico Military Museum and served as a volunteer archivist and collections manager there. She used her time there to become intimately familiar with her father's experiences through diaries, letters, interviews with other POWs. And the product of her research is this book and the subject of today's talk, From Bataan to Freedom. It's my pleasure to introduce Judy Reed.
Thank you, Will, very much. First, I want to extend my appreciation for the opportunity to actually be here and share the information I received from going through all of those archives and doing a lot of reading and interviews. There were about 15 million Americans served in the U.S. military in World War II, and an estimated 50 million people worldwide died. There were 8 times more POWs of the Japanese that died than POWs of the Germans. And a lot of what I'm saying, I know you're going to know it already. Bear with me. My father, Errett's POW camps spanned 5 of them, 3 in the Philippines and 2 in Japan. The 3 in the Philippines, the first one was Camp O'Donnell, which was before the fighting started there, was the Philippine Army Training Facility. The second one was Cabanatuan. And they made, movie, the Great Escape was Cabanatuan. And Ghost Soldiers, the Hampton Sides book, great book on it. And the third one was Billy Bid Prison, which was in Manila, the city of Manila. And it was a prison, but it was in pretty poor shape by the time the POWs got into it. And the 2 in Japan were Mitsushima and Kanosei. Now, he was in O'Donnell for 2.5 months. Then they vacated that, moved him all to Cabanatuan. He was there for 4 months. He was only in Billy Bid for 11 days. He was just there to get a transport ship to his next unknown POW camp. And he was in Mitsushima and Kanosei both for each a year and a half. I peppered my book with events that were happening in World War II, primarily to give me a sense of what was going on, what was going on in the greater scope of the war when my dad was being treated, however he was being treated. I was curious to see if there was any result that he received because of things going on. And there were a couple of times, but it wasn't as much as I thought it would be. But nonetheless, I love the information in there, so I kept it in there. My story, the book, does have a nexus with 3 other things, though. One is the Manhattan Project, that the atomic bombs came from. And that is because in New Mexico, the U.S. attorney at the time, between 1942 and 1946, was Howard House. And he signed the condemnation papers for the property that actually became what is now Los Alamos, where the Manhattan Project under General Groves and Robert Oppenheimer was being followed up with. And he met my father's older sister, Merle, while my father was in a POW camp, and they ended up getting married before my father was liberated. So he was my uncle. Excuse me. The other nexus that my book has is with Bruns Army Hospital. And at the time, the war was obviously winding down, and lots of soldiers were returning that needed medical care. So the government established 100 Army hospitals around the country, and one of them was in Santa Fe, which is where my father lived at the time when he joined the Coast Artillery. And his father, my grandfather, actually got a job at Bruns Army Hospital as soon as it opened in, I have to look here, 1943, and it closed in January of 1947. And my grandfather worked there the entire time. And the last nexus I put in the book is with the Department of Justice Japanese internment camp, which was established in Santa Fe to house, at its peak, it housed about 2,100, what they termed enemy aliens. And I have it in there mostly because I wasn't making any moral comparisons or anything to the prisoners, but the conditions that the Japanese internment men had were starkly different than the conditions my father and the POWs he was with had. So I thought it was a kind of an interesting contrast. I didn't have any relatives that worked there, though. Where's the little remote? Oh, up there. Thank you. Thank you. Maybe I have it upside down. No. Oh,
It's great, the lights.
thank you. I said, bear with me. There we go. So my father died in 1992 from complications of emphysema. After his funeral, my mother handed me these two diaries. One, the larger one on the left, was authorized by his Japanese captors, and the smaller one, which is actually, it's only like 2 by 3 inches, it's very small, but that was not authorized for him to have, but he secreted away and kept it hidden, and they never found it. So she gave me these diaries, and I thought, wow, I've known that my father was in World War II. I knew that he was part of the Coast Artillery, the New Mexico National Guard Coast Artillery. I knew he was in the Philippines. I knew he had been a prisoner of the Japanese, but I never knew he had diaries. That was the first I'd ever heard of them or seen them. Because of the lack of knowing them, and they didn't talk too much about their time, the POWs. I had conjured up all those decades growing up. I had conjured up my own version of what my father did to enlist in the National Guard. And I'm just going to read briefly for you. For years, I imagined a poignant scene in which he and 3 of his school chums decided to enlist. The 4 are in their respective Santa Fe, New Mexico homes that fateful day Pearl Harbor was bombed. The Lujans had just finished eating when the startling news in Franklin Roosevelt's firm, bold, and outright outraged voice emanated from the radio to inform stunned listeners that our naval fleet had been attacked in Hawaii. There is little else talked about in the following 2 days. Mothers huddle in groups in their neighborhoods, spreading news as fast as it arrives. Fathers and older sons go to the plaza as an impromptu meeting place. Every face is dazed, and every conversation is about current events. The drone of conversation fills the streets, the shops, homes, churches, and schools. By the third day, my imaginary scene unfolds among the escalating pitch of voices from the men in the plaza, and their dazed faces become more animated. Errett and his 3 closest friends are in the crowd and form a pact with one another to enlist. They are committed to carrying out their decision, even knowing it may cost them their lives. They run 2 miles uphill from the plaza to the National Guard Armory, never stopping to talk, but talking all the way. They are some of the first to arrive to the recruiting office that day, and they enlist without hesitating. So that was what I had brewed or conjured up in my mind about my father enlisting. And I looked at his diaries, and it was obviously everything I had thought of was all fantasy. None of it would fit the dates. He actually enlisted in March of 1940, well before Pearl Harbor was attacked. And he was in the Philippines well before they were attacked. He was there in September 41. And I thought, after I set forth and transcribed both diaries, and I was very disappointed because they didn't give me the information I wanted to know about his experience in the war. And he was, of course, not around to ask. Not that I think he would tell me because I was his daughter, but I set out on a course to research it all. And as Will explained, it was interviews and archives and reading and all of that, and I loved it. The other thing is he enlisted in the 111th Cavalry at the time in 1940, and he was 17 years old, but he was activated in January 1941, and that was 5 months before his high school graduation. And then after they were activated and quarantined for two weeks, they were sent to Fort Bliss for training on their anti-aircraft guns because they had been redesignated from a cavalry unit to a coast artillery regiment. This is part of Company C. Company C is comprised of men from Santa Fe. The population of Santa Fe at the time at 1940 was just a little over 20,000. Company C was one of the smallest in the state, companies in the state in the National Guard. It only had 87 at the time. My father was in it, and enlisted in it. And he, of course, is the one I've circled there. And on the left of him, as you're looking at him, is Felipe Trejo, and on the right is Bill Brown. And both of those gentlemen perished before the war was over, perished overseas. And that they were just 2 among half of the 1,800 men that were part of that regiment that didn't come home. Felipe Trejo died from friendly fire of our own anti-aircraft guns, and early in the battle. And Bill Brown died of malnutrition, diseases, and lack of medical attention at Cabanatuan. Bill Brown's death he was 5.5 years older than my father, but his death profoundly affected my father. And if you want, I'll tell you later about that. While they were at Fort Bliss, one of the things that they did often was they had to practice their convoy and moving these anti-aircraft guns and setting them up and taking them down. And so they did that many weeks. And they did it mostly in southern New Mexico. And one time they went to Carlsbad Caverns, and as just a little fun thing to do, to sightsee. It's part of the National Park Service. And they got their regimental picture taken in front of this. They were all kind of stuffed in to the huge rock opening and fronting a cave that goes in. And in that rock opening and in the cave, hundreds of bats live. And people still go there today to see these bats leave at dusk and go feed. And then they come on back little by little before dawn. And so they had their picture taken there. Well, while my father was a prisoner of war, what was he, an oral dentist, an oral surgeon, had also gone to Carlsbad Caverns sometime in the past and came up with this kind of nifty idea, he thought, for there to be incendiary bombs made. And he sent his idea, he laid it out, said how to do it, sent the idea to Franklin Roosevelt, who sent it went to 2 or 3 other departments, and they to evaluate. And finally, one of them thought, okay, it looks like this might work. Let's give it a test run. So what the process was gathering up a bunch of bats. This is where he got the idea, Dr. Adams from Carlsbad, gathering up a bunch of bats and sedating them at night and strapping little 1/2 ounce incendiary bombs on them. And then as the sedation's starting to wear off, put them in airplanes and then drop them over those combustible buildings that the Japanese always had. So they gave it a test run. The bats were supposed to gnaw off the cords that were holding on this little incendiary bomb, and they were supposed to burn for 4 minutes afterwards. So they dropped the bats. I don't know how many there were, but they dropped them. Half of them didn't survive that. And the other half somehow got into the buildings, and the buildings did burn. Unfortunately, they weren't the buildings on the base that they had erected for them to burn. They were the buildings on the base that they were using. And then one bomb landed in a general's car, and it ignited and then blew up. So that was it. They scrapped that idea after that. The other thing at Fort Bliss that was done, there were 4 regiments there training on their anti-aircraft guns. And General Oliver Spiller, who was the head of the whole training on anti-aircraft guns nationwide, was there visiting because they were going to have a live fire competition. General Spiller was from the state of Washington originally, and the 63rd Coast Artillery was also training there, and they're from the state of Washington. So he was vociferously supporting them in winning this competition. Unfortunately, they did not win. They shot so close. The plane was hauling a 500-foot fabric target for them to shoot at. But the 63rd shot so close to the plane and almost downed it that the pilot let go of the target, and then he flew away. He didn't come back for a little while, but he finally did. And Company C, the company my father was in, they had the best score by shredding the target with 4 rounds. And companies B and D had of the 200th had the next best scores, which is admirable, but it also probably won them a trip to the Philippines 5 months before their year training was supposed to be up. So they were sent to San Francisco, and they went on 2 ships. The first ship that crossed Errett was on, and that was the USS President Pierce. But most of the 200th came 10 days later, or went 10 days later to the Philippines on the USS Coolidge. Before he reached Hawaii, because they told him they could send letters home once they reached Hawaii. So he sat down and wrote one just before he got to Hawaii, and just in it, he says, and I can just hear him saying this out loud, "Have had about enough of this boat ride." He had never been on a boat before. "If I ever have enough money to decide to take an ocean trip, I hope someone just shoots me. It's not that I have been seasick or anything. It's just too much damn water." So he was not thrilled with that. And then 2 days out of the Philippines, they encountered a typhoon. They battled that for 36 hours, and it had 90 mile an hour wind and 60-foot waves. And they finally got there, and I don't think that added to his love of boat rides at all. That's Fort Stotzenberg. That's where he was deployed to in the Philippines. He he arrived there in September 1941, and the 200th was there to protect Clark Airfield, which was right next door to Fort Stotzenberg. And it was located about 40 miles northwest of Manila. And Clark Airfield was the main Army Air Corps in the Western Pacific at the time. The 200th Regiment was the largest regiment at the time. Philippine Islands had, at that time, 5 U.S. Army posts and 1 Navy base. Dad had yet to have those graphic, horrific images seared into his brain at that time. And so he wrote another letter home, and in it he said, "When I get home, I will have a lot to tell everyone. I think I'll like it here." Little did he know. The anti-aircraft guns, many of you are probably way more familiar with them than I am, but they are comprised of a gun, a height finder, and what they called a director. And the director is an analog computer, and each director hooked up to 4 guns and then the height finders read the information. Well, the men using the height finders read the information, and they would set the target and all that stuff. And so these parts were put in trailers and pulled by trucks, and that's how they moved from place to place. Now, Pearl Harbor was hit 1 a.m. on December 8th, Philippine time. Clark Airfield was bombed 11 hours later, around noonish, along with Wake Island and Guam, Hong Kong, and other places. They realized straight away that first day that Manila had no protective coverage. So they peeled off 500 men from the 200th, added 175 Filipino Army troops to it, and designated it the 515th Coast Artillery Regiment. Errett was in the 515th. They went to, in the middle of the night, they went to Manila. They made their way to Manila. They found crates, unopened crates, of new anti-aircraft guns that were there waiting for the men to actually assemble them. They didn't realize they needed to be so quick. So they uncrated them. They were covered in, and I guess is cosmoline still used today? Yes. So it was thick. Dad complained about that all the time. It was thickly covered, the metal, because that's what kept it from rusting while it was in transit and waiting to be opened and cleaned up and put together. So they had, the 515th had 12, I believe. Yeah, 12 anti-aircraft guns that they said, this is just Company C, had 12 anti-aircraft guns and 23 anti-tank guns, and I don't know how many, but 50 caliber guns, 3 directors and 3 height finders. And they got them all cleaned up and working by morning, by daylight. And they were the first company to have done that morning. The others had theirs done pretty quickly. The 515th and 200th used those anti-aircraft guns during their 4 months of fighting. They covered the retreat to Bataan, which was part of the War Plan Orange instructions, I guess, guidance that had been developed, decades ago. And their job was to cover the 80,000 troops and 26,000 refugees that were retreating to Bataan. But as you all know, they were ordered to surrender on the 9th of April, 1942. But before they were ordered to surrender, 12,000 British troops in Hong Kong surrendered on the Christmas before, 1941, and 130,000 British troops surrendered in Singapore in February, just before that. The 200th and the 515th are credited, I think officially, with being the first and the last to fire on enemy planes in the Philippines. Most of the roughly 8,600 POWs on the Bataan Death March had to walk it. Very few got a truck ride there, but a few did. Some of those bodies some of the men whose bodies were left in the road on the death march and were not allowed to be removed, by the time the last of the POWs made the last few, couple of miles into Camp O'Donnell, they couldn't recognize them as having been human beings. They were just dark stains in the dirt. And I think everybody knows about the Death March, and there are a lot of books written about it. And I did include many things, but I didn't have to dwell on it because I think it's quite well known. The Death March in its totality was 65 miles long. Errett walked 54 of those miles, and wherever you were at the time of the surrender depended on how far you had to walk. And he did his 54 miles in 10 days. He was allowed a rest break. His first rest break was when he reached, after he finished 19 miles. He arrived at O'Donnell POW camp one day after the Doolittle raid that happened, which that Doolittle raid, again, which everybody knows, ended up costing 250,000 Chinese their lives because the Japanese took retribution for helping the American pilots. The defense of Bataan, a lot of people figure, put Japan about 6 months behind their hopeful schedule of invading Australia. At Cabanatuan, I mentioned that's where Bill Brown died, and Dad always said, because they moved everybody from O'Donnell to Cabanatuan. And Dad always said, I didn't hear him say a lot of things, but what I did hear him say, I heard him say more than once. But he said this probably the most often, that it seemed like the big guys, because my father was not a big guy, but he said the big guys seemed to collapse and give up hope and die first before the others did. And by the time he was one of the people that I told you went to Bilibid prison. Well, there were 3,000 from Cabanatuan that were, when he went, that were taken out of the big group and sent to Manila and Bilibid prison, where he spent 11 days to get on a transport ship. He had no clue. None of them had any idea where they were going to be sent. But he went to the Manila docks and was loaded onto the Nagato Maru. He was part of 1,500 that were loaded. They had 3 holds, so they roughly divided them evenly. Some of them didn't have as much space as the other. But it took 3 weeks for that ship to get to Japan. And while he was en route there, this is 6 months after they were ordered to surrender, by then, half of the POWs that had been surrendered were dead. And most of those were Filipinos. I'm at an angle, so I'm not going to use the pointer, but I think you can read it good enough. This is the main island of Honshu with Hokkaido and Shikoku and Kyushu. And Moji was their destination. Moji is on the southern tip, you see, of Honshu. And then he was going up to, there it is. I'm going to try it it's kind of maybe. There's Moji. And then he's going to Mitsushima, which is, I don't see it now. But Mitsushima is in the center of Honshu. That was his POW camp, and next to the Tenru River. Mitsushima was, he arrived there on Thanksgiving Day. I almost forgot that. But when they reached Moji, they took everybody was ordered up on deck, and it was very cold, and everything had frost covering it. There were 27 that didn't survive the 3-week voyage over there, but everybody was ordered up on deck. And then they were ordered to go stand on the pier. And about 150 were so sick and infirmed and not well, they couldn't make it off the deck. But Errett was one of them that could. They went down on the pier as told. They undressed as they were told to do. And then some Japanese women came by and sprayed each one of them with some icy cold disinfectant. Their feet froze to the pier. And then they had glass rods that they used to get, for whatever reason, rectal samples. They left to get on trains to go to Mitsushima. But when they did go walk over to they were given clothes. When they did walk over to the train station, they looked back, and those 150 men on the deck still hadn't moved, and nobody ever heard or saw from any of them again. So I think we all know what their fate was. The Mitsushima was also known as Tokyo Camp Number 3B, and his group that went there was just under 100 men, which isn't a very, large number. The business that was running that labor camp was the Kumagai Engineering Company, and they were overseeing the construction of a hydroelectric plant on the Tenru River. It's actually working today. It's known as the Hiraoka Dam, construction was begun in 1938, but it didn't finish until 1951. Errett's primary job, it wasn't every day, but it was most every day. His primary job was mixing cement, but he had to do it with his bare hands. And if any of you have ever heard of somebody doing that or done it yourself, you know that that does not work well on your skin. It rots your skin away. He said at times he'd look down and his skin would just peel off like taking rubber gloves off. And it hurt. He did get payment every now and then, and a lot of POWs said they never were paid, but he did get a little. He received one time $7.80 for 2 months' work at the dam site. The guards at the dam site were civilian guards; they weren't military guards. But 2 days after he and those just under 100 men got to Mitsushima, 190 British POWs arrived. And there were also 2 camps upstream, not far away, but upstream next to the Tenru. One was a Korean camp with 3,500 people at it, and some of them had their families. And the other was a Chinese camp of about 180 people. Mitsushima, in the end, ended up being one of the most notoriously cruelly run POW camps in that area. The person that he hated the most among there was named Tatsuo Tsuchiya. And he was affectionately known as Little Glass Eye because he had a glass eye and he was little. My father so hated him, he devised a plan to kill him. His first bath was New Year's Day, 1943, his first bath since being surrendered. And not counting the icy disinfectant thing, that wasn't a bath. With the British prisoners came some from the Singapore Technical Corps. And Errett had several of these photos of those POWs. I just happened to put up 8 of them, but he had a lot of them. And I need to look at their numbers because he has in his diaries, he has their names. And I'm hoping those numbers are attached to these and they have a name. Or I hope they have numbers so I can give them a name. Even though Mitsushima was one of the worst camps around, Errett had a few bright moments in it. And a few of those moments came from an elder Japanese man that was a civilian, lived outside nearby, and he would toss my father gifts over the fence under the cover of darkness. Things like pouches of tobacco, cigarettes, chili, which he really liked, pepper, and just about a month and a half before his 21st birthday, and this is 1943, he got the man tossed a bottle of wine to him. So he saved that, and that's how he celebrated his 21st birthday on his birthday. He was, that same May that he turned 21, he was allowed to send his first communication home to his family. And that was nice, but his family had already learned. It took him 5 months to learn after the surrender, but they had finally learned that he was alive because it was printed in a newspaper. The names of some of the ones that they knew of that were known to be confirmed to be alive and POWs, and my dad's name was among it. The first letter he got from his family wasn't until January 1944. But at Mitsushima, the other small pleasure was newspapers. They would get, dozens and dozens. One day they got 600 newspapers in. Most of them were in English, which kind of surprised me. And they gave them to the POWs, and they were from many different presses, maybe eight or so different presses that I read of. So, can you guess who the little guy with the glasses is? That's Little Glass Eye. So you can see my father did not succeed in killing him, because this is in January 1946, and he's leaving the courtroom after his trial in Yokohama. He was convicted to life at hard labor. That he got hard labor for 7 years, I think it was. And nobody could kind of believe it. And some of the POWs that I talked to, who were at the same camps that my father, looked into it. And they told me that what they think happened, and he was the first Japanese military person to be tried for war crimes. He was the very first one. But they thought what happened was the atrocities that he committed actually got mixed up in the paperwork, and they were put in the file of another person at Mitsushima who was Big Glass Eye. And he was convicted and hung. And he wasn't nearly as bad as this fellow. But they found this is a bigger poster. I forget what they called them. But anyway, he saw it taped to the front glass. There's a diner on the plaza in Santa Fe, and it was taped on the glass of this restaurant facing outwards. And he and my mother were walking by it. And of course, this stopped him in his tracks. And the owner, who knew he had been a prisoner, came out and apologized, but he offered, you may have this if you would like it. And Dad said, yes, I would. And he did take it. Let's see. Just before his year and a half at Mitsushima ended, there was another call for a new labor force at a new camp. And however those things happened, Errett was one of the ones that went. And they only took 100. They took 50 and 50 British and 50 Americans. But before they took them, they had them clean up, they shaved their heads, and they had this picture taken of them. So this is his first POW picture. He got on the train to go to his next camp, and that was Kanose. And Kanose is, if you remember where Mitsushima is and the top of the Tenyu River, it's just north of that. You can see Kanose POW camp. It's about 30 miles inland from the coast where Niigata is. And the place that was in charge of work there was the Showa Denko carbide plant. And he found that Kanose was much better conditions, much better treatment than Mitsushima, but that wasn't hard to do because Mitsushima was so terribly bad. This is it was so much more relaxed there that they allowed entertainment. So the British, these are all British except for the two on the corners, left and right. They I think are I know this one is a Singapore Technical Corps playing the guitar, but they put on performances. The British loved putting on performances. They did pantomimes, and they had singing groups and plays and skits, and they had names like, I'm really curious. I wish I would have known the names of them before the fellows that I interviewed passed away. Like Head Tucked Under Her Arm. I mean, I can come up with all sorts of ideas of what that might mean, but none of them make any sense. They had the kind of say Follies, the Gold Rush Review, and Babes in the Wood. So the fellow with the guitar on the lower right, I think is, because he's referenced in some diaries as being a very good guitar player. So I think that is probably V.R. Fernandez. This is the last Christmas that my father spent and these men spent as a POW. And of course, they're at Canose. And you can tell just by looking at their faces that the weaker men are sitting down because they probably can't stand up that long. And then the gentleman standing on the right, they have no shoes on. Having a lack of shoes and boots was a big problem because most Americans had bigger feet than the shoes and boots that they were giving out. My father, who is standing on the far left, being a smaller guy, got a new pair of boots. He's wearing them there. And I think that perhaps I think that guy there might be the Commandant, Azuma, standing next to the tallest POW at the head of the table or the back of the table. I think that might be Azuma, and he was the Commandant there. They had several visits from the Red Cross over the years. And when they came, and they knew ahead of time, of course, that they were coming, the Red Cross boxes that had arrived there, which the prisoners rarely got, were all locked away. And they had food and clothes and all sorts of things in them. They were locked away. And when the Red Cross would come, they would bring them out and stuff like the equivalent of a commissary, maybe, the shelves with all this stuff and pretend that the POWs had access to them, whenever they could spend their $7.80 every 2 months on something. But they didn't. 15 minutes after the Red Cross representatives left, they all went back into locked storage. They did allow a few boxes, especially closer to the end of the war. And I think maybe the commandants knew that the war was going to end, and they knew that they had not been good hosts, if you want to call them that, and that they would probably end up, if they didn't give some of them out, they would end up being charged with more cruelty acts than what they already had earned. So as it got closer to the end of the war, those Red Cross boxes were sent out to the POWs, at least at the camp that my father was in. And he truly loved them. But this was the first meal that came out, a big meal that they were actually allowed to eat. And as you all know, I almost forgot. The men, they have all sorts of medical problems, dysentery, malaria, relapses, all that stuff still. But they also all had all sorts of different sorts of intestinal worms. So they had so many that they created a competition once a week. And so a month before this, 2 months before this photo was taken, my father asked one of those little guys out, and he took it, he measured it, because that's what you had to do. You had to measure it and take it in and post your whatever the length was to see if you won. I don't know if they won a title or a crown, or I don't know what they won, but his was 12 inches long. He was very, very proud of having done that. And he said, I was glad to get rid of, and they had a worm cure that actually worked quite well with one dose. Sometimes it needed more than one. But he said in his diary, he said, I don't have enough to eat myself. I certainly don't have enough to share with a guy like that or a thing like that. And as you all know, the atomic bomb on that was detonated over Hiroshima on August 6th, and then again on Nagasaki on August 9th, was something that they heard of, and they also read it in the papers, and they heard of it by the 10th of August, so the day after Nagasaki. And they heard it because they, at Kanose, they had a radio, and they tore it apart, or took it apart, and gave it to different men to hide away. And my father was one of them. And then when they wanted to hear news, they would Frankenstein it back together and listen. And so they heard both through the newspaper and the radio that the bombs had detonated and that the war looked like it was going to end. The Hirohito's rescript was played on the radio at noon on August 15th. And I actually can't remember if they heard it or on the radio. I think they did. And it was also in the newspapers because, of course, that was huge news in Japan. And then the signing of the surrender was on the USS Missouri on September 2nd. When Errett left Kanose, and remember I told you most of the 2/3 of the prisoners there were British, and actually 90 more arrived just around the time that the atomic bombs went off. And I think they were moving people away from other camps and maybe assembling them because they knew the end was coming. But he acquired a British tunic, and that's what this thing used to be, a British tunic. And it's been modified. The sleeves are gone, and it's cut short a little bit. And then he had his fellow POWs, before they left Kanose, sign it. And that was on display here for almost 10 years. And then because of my book, and I gave a talk when my book came out last year in Santa Fe at the National Guard there. They asked for it back because they wanted it to be be on display in their collection. And I had never seen this until I walked in there to volunteer and catalog their archives. And General Fox was on the phone, so I was looking around and I saw this there. And then I thought, wow, that's really interesting. And then I saw a little tag. It says, donated by Errett Lujan. And I thought, no, that's not his. I've never seen that before. And come to find out that, yes, that was his. And in fact, my brothers and I weren't allowed to root around in our parents' closets. But the grandchildren, hey, that's a whole nother story. They took that thing out. They played dress up with it. They had it everywhere. They knew it existed. They didn't know what it was, but I had never seen it before I saw it sitting in the National Guard case. He left, Errett left finally, Kanose, on the 6th of September. So that's 4 days after the surrender on the Missouri was signed. And 4 days ago was the 80th anniversary of that date, or of that event. And he brought this vest home. And I truly want to thank all of you for sitting through this. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have, or at least try to answer them. And I appreciate, again, the National Guard here, the foundation, all of you. I appreciate you so much for giving me this opportunity. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Oh, yes, ma'am. No, my father went back once, and it took him until like 1963 to go. He was discharged in May of 46. He didn't stay in, but I have wanted to go back. There have been a couple of times that it almost kind of happened. The closest I've been is Saipan, and it's kind of close. Have you been there?
I am a part of my father shared up in my Air Force. My two younger sisters are actually born in FSCs.
Oh,
I'm also proud to start family. Unfortunately, I'm close to a whole star sister. My mother was
no.
She in this there. My mother spoke no, and I was followed by another also gaming with her. Yeah. But definitely would like to get your information because it would be an honor for you to go.
Oh, I think so. And he loved the Filipino people. That's why he liked it there. He loved them. Any other questions? Anybody? Yes, sir.
Judy, your honor for expressing says how we got to survive. Yes, of course.
Every single POW that I listened to and talked to said the same thing. And they said, but for the grace of God, I have no idea why I came back and those other didn't. I have an idea of why he did make it. He was, as I said, short of stature, but he had what in the family we call, amongst ourselves, we call it stubbornness, a wide streak of stubbornness. I call it willpower. But he had that. And then he's little. If you have a big guy and you're all on the same meager rations that aren't enough to keep almost a baby alive, the big guys are going to go first because their bodies need more than a little guy. And I think those two things, his willpower and his stature being smaller, I think that those were two of his probably most saving graces that got him home alive, because he got in trouble and he got beat up many times. And he had all the diseases that everybody had, of course.
I have a question. When the atomic bombs are dropped, did you ever hear from him or anybody else in the camp? What changed about with the guards and the prisoners there? Because I've heard other accounts at different camps that the prisoners woke up one day and all the guards were gone. So they figured, oh, something must be going on. Do you have any sense of what it was like at his camp?
Yes, and because I wanted to know that, especially at the camp he was at. He was not, kind of say, that's not close enough to even see, hear, or feel anything physical when the bombs went off. But if he had still been at Mitsushima, because that camp, Mitsushima, was down, it had short mountain range all around it. But if he was on the top there, he could have actually seen it, but he wasn't at Mitsushima. And they did, at his camp, the guards just went away. That's right. They just kind of disappeared, except for the camp commandant, Azuma. He stayed, and he actually tried to give his sword to whoever the leading, they had a leading British and a leading American officer at the camp. And Azuma tried to surrender his sword in an official ceremony, and they wouldn't take it. But the Japanese hit Azuma, and there had to have been a couple there, because they turned all of their guns over to the POWs. And then everybody except Azuma left. And I don't know if he stayed the whole time, but I think he did, because he kept telling them, don't go into town because you don't know, the people may not treat you well. But they went into town anyway, and nobody treated them bad. None of the civilians treated them bad after the war was actually over. So they left. But they got crazy at the end too. They were, a couple of them were getting drunk all the time, but they were spinning stories that was like all the airplanes that were shot down in the Mariana, or the ships, I think, the Mariana Turkey Shoot, if everybody knows that, around Saipan, not too far from Saipan. The guards there knew of it, but they turned it around. It was the Americans' ships and planes that got shot down, and Japan's were the heroes, and they're the ones that survived it. So they just took credit. Just maybe that was their way of coping. I don't know. But yeah, they disappeared. Well, that was a problem, because Kanase was not. They didn't even get. They were dropping supplies after the surrender and all that, and Kanase, they didn't know it existed there, and it was small, so they were among the last to get supplies dropped. But once there was Captain Hewitt was the senior officer of the Americans at Kanase and at Mitsushima. And he would go on the train into Niigata, because that was a source of information of how everything was supposed to go. And he could contact higher level American officers. And so he would come back with the information, and he said, okay, September 6th, the train will be here, because the Americans controlled it all by then. The trains will be here. Everybody get on the train. We'll take you. I think they took them to, to Tokyo. No, I forget where in Japan they took them. Maybe Moji, and they took the other route back from. No, they went. I forget where they went first, but then they ended up at Okinawa. They flew them to Okinawa, and unfortunately. And then they went to Manila. After Okinawa, they went to Manila and put them on a transport ship back at Manila. But they had a huge cast of people that were organizing this. And you can imagine what that was like, because the logistics had to have been mind-boggling somewhat. But Dad was on one of the planes that took off. There were bombers being used now as transport ships in the air, and he was sitting. So he was called up. You can go get on this plane, and we'll take you to wherever it is they were going to go in Asia, in the Far East. And one poor soul, I can't imagine. And I don't think my dad, if he knew his name, I never heard it. My brother told me this story, because my dad told it to my brother. He was sitting on the bomb doors, and they somehow opened, and he dropped out into the ocean on the way home. But it was like the last leg before he got on the ship. And I thought, I just can't imagine, but it was not easy. Well, thank you very much. Oh, one more.
You can measure the time. Watch.
Oh,
In your research, did he have any recollections of that?
oh, he had nightmares of it. Yeah, he had lots of recollection of it. A lot of people, I think every man from there did. There was a boy that was a Filipino that was, and this is another thing I heard him say. He didn't talk very much, like I said, about it, but the Filipinos were tossing food to the soldiers as they were on the death march. And that was a dangerous thing to do, because if a mom did it and she was holding a baby, that baby got skewered on a Yeah. On the bayonet and just dumped. And this one young boy, he's probably a young teenager, tossed an orange to somebody, not to my father, but somebody nearby. And the guard saw it and just turned around and killed him. He killed him with a bayonet. And they still lined up, and they tried to be more secretive about giving them food, but the Filipino people still lined up to give them food. There was all sorts of atrocities done to the men. The one guy was, and I think this I put in the book, one guy, there's a lot about the Bataan Death March that I didn't put in my book, but he had some infraction about him. And I think it was probably, he had a lighter that said made in Japan, and that's a contraband to have something from Japan. So they made him, I don't know if he's standing or kneeling, but the game was, because they created games with how to kill these guys on the death march. And so the game was, you have to lock both arms of the POW off before he hits the ground. And then you accomplish something. And that was one of their games. And that was described. But yeah, he had nightmares about all of that his whole life. Yes, sir.
Things about my father is a survivor of the Apollo Bataan. He lost his arm during the war. He was a second lieutenant with the Philippine Army.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
I remember when I was a kid, I used to put the artificial ants supplied by America. So his ambition before the war was to be an engineer, but because he lost his arm, he studied as a lawyer.
A lawyer.
But during those times, being an engineer is a more manual.
Yes, that's true. That's true. It would be.
Even famously great in the Missouri, so where you.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
My uncle, my mother's brother was taken to death before the war.
And
he endured that his suffering because he was telling me
we never had, the whole time he was alive, there was never one Japanese made product in our house, and none of our cars, obviously.
My mother told me that they lost the kids there. They
Yep.
I have pictures of that actually.
There's, like I said, there's so much of that that's out there. I could only put so much in because I couldn't do it all.
We're very fortunate, very bad. We're all retired nurses throughout the field.
Oh,
I worked here for 40 years. I actually, 40 years experience.
oh, wow.
I'm retired now, so
Oh,
I had the chance to go to Hiroshima last October with my dad. And it's really very, the carnage of the pictures doing that.
mhm.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, war is kind of unbelievable, isn't it? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Judy. Just this token of thanks, I want to present the Foundation's annual ornament to you.
Oh, I love those things.
Great.
Oh,
So,
thank you, Will.
thanks again for being here.
Yeah, that was a real presentation.